The Night Shift, a story of what the dying see inspired by true accounts posted to r/nosleep, r/ghost stories, and r/nursing part 1, the first year chapter 1. Why I chose the night shift. I have been a palliative care nurse for 11 years, and I have been on the night shift for 9 of those 11, which is a choice that people who do not work nights find either admirable or puzzling, and which is actually neither. I chose the night shift because it is quieter and more honest than the day shift, which is not a commentary on the character of day shift nurses, who are excellent and work harder than the available hours allow, but a commentary on what the hospital is at night versus what it is during the day. During the day, a hospital is a machine. It processes patients through its stages with the coordinated momentum of a very large and very complicated system that has been optimized for throughput, for the movement of people from one condition to a better one, or, on the floors where I work, to the end of the road with as much dignity as the system can provide. The machine is loud. It makes the noise of everything a machine makes, the noise of its own operation and the noise of the people who operate it, and the noise of the people who move through it, and the noise of the institution asserting itself over the raw material of human experience. At night, the machine slows. Not completely. Nothing in a hospital slows completely, but enough that you can hear the hospital underneath the hospital. The thing the building is when the throughput stops and the visitors go home and the administrative layer withdraws, and what is left is the essential business of the place. At night, the essential business is clear and unadorned. It is people near the end of their lives, resting or not resting, sleeping or not sleeping, and the nurses who are with them. That is what I chose. That is what I have been doing for 9 years on the palliative care floor of a large teaching hospital in the north of England. I want to tell you what I have seen. Not all of it. Some of it I have no language for, and some of it I have promised, silently, to the people I saw it with, to carry in the way that some things should be carried, inward and alone. But some of it I need to tell. The part I need to tell is the part that changed how I understood the work, and how I understood the thing that happens at the end of a life, the specific and particular thing that happens in the hours and days before death, that the medical literature describes in one vocabulary, and that every nurse who has worked the night shift on a palliative floor for long enough comes to describe in another. I will start with Margaret Osai, because she was the first. Chapter 2, Margaret Osai, Room 14. I was 29 and in my first year on the palliative floor when I met Margaret Osai. She was 81, and she had been on the floor for 3 weeks when I began my rotation, and she was the kind of patient who shaped the atmosphere of a ward simply by being in it, the way certain people shape the atmosphere of any room they occupy. She had been a teacher for 40 years, secondary school mathematics, and she still had the quality of a person who expected attention and expected it to be paid correctly. She was dying of ovarian cancer, which had been discovered late and which had progressed with the quiet efficiency of something that had been working undetected for a long time. She was not in significant pain by the time I met her, because we were managing that successfully. But she was tired in a specific way that I was learning to recognize on the palliative floor, a tiredness that was different from ordinary illness fatigue, a tiredness of the specific quality of someone who has been here a very long time and has decided they are ready for the next thing. She did not talk much during the first week I was on her care. She was a private woman, and the ward was not a private environment, and she had accommodated this with the dignity of someone who had decided that dignity was a matter of internal state rather than external circumstance. But on the 9th night, which was a Tuesday at about 2 in the morning, She was awake when I came in to check her lines, and she said, without preamble, "There are people in my room." I looked around the room. The room was the room, the bed and the monitoring equipment and the window with its view of the hospital car park and the night sky above it. I said, "I am the only one here, Mrs. Osai." She said, "No, there are two others. A woman by the window and a man at the foot of the bed." She said it matter-of-factly, not with fear. The way she said things, which was clearly and without unnecessary inflection. I said, "Can you describe them?" She said, "The woman is wearing a green dress. Her hair is gray. She is looking out the window. She has been there for about an hour." She paused. She said, "The man at the foot of the bed is my father." I looked at the foot of the bed. The foot of the bed was the foot of the bed. I said, "What is your father doing?" She said, "Watching. He does not need to do anything. He has come to be here." Her voice when she said this had a quality I could not immediately classify. Not fear, not grief, though grief was part of it. Something that sat in the territory of comfort, but that was deeper than comfort. Something more fundamental, the specific quality of a person who has been waiting for something and who has just understood that the wait is almost over. I sat with her for a while. I did not dismiss what she was telling me. I did not say you are tired or it is the medication or the mind does strange things at the end. I sat in the chair beside her bed and I looked at the foot of the bed and the window and I said nothing for a while. She died the following afternoon. Not the night, the afternoon, with her daughter holding one hand and a nurse holding the other, and the room full of the particular quality of light that came through the east-facing window in the late afternoon. Her daughter told me afterward that in the last minutes, Margaret had looked at the foot of the bed with a specific expression. Not the expression of someone in pain or fear, but the expression of someone who has recognized the face of a person they have not seen in a very long time. Her father had died 43 years before she did. I noted the case in my personal journal that evening, and I wrote at the bottom of the entry, "This is either a neurological artifact of the dying process, or it is something else, and I do not yet have enough information to know which." I spent the next 9 years gathering information. Chapter 3, what the literature says. There is a literature on this subject. It is not a small literature. It exists in the medical journals in the vocabulary of end-of-life care. And it exists in the nursing literature in the more candid vocabulary of people who are reporting what they have observed rather than what they have measured. And it exists in the hospice literature in the vocabulary of people who have decided that the gap between what they can measure and what they observe is itself a significant data point. The phenomenon has a clinical name, terminal lucidity, when it involves the unexpected return of mental clarity in patients who have been confused or unresponsive. It has a more specific name in the sub-literature, nearing death awareness, which describes the experiences reported by dying patients in the days and hours before death that include visions of deceased relatives, perception of an imminent journey, and communication with presences invisible to the attending staff. The literature is careful. It is careful in the way that medical literature is careful, which is to say, it describes the observations and notes their frequency and consistency, and then declines to conclude anything about their cause beyond the neurological mechanisms that might produce them. The neurological mechanisms proposed include cerebral hypoxia, the effects of opioid medication on the temporal lobe, and the generalized disruption of sensory processing that accompanies the dying brain's withdrawal from its ordinary functioning. These explanations are plausible. I am a nurse with a scientific education, and I find them plausible. I also find them insufficient. I find them insufficient not because I have ruled them out, but because they do not account for the specific and consistent quality of what the patients I have cared for describe. The neurological explanations predict hallucinations, which are typically characterized by confusion, by the inability of the person experiencing them to distinguish between the hallucinatory content and reality, and by a distressing rather than comforting character in a significant proportion of cases. What my patients describe is not characterized by any of these things. It is characterized, across 11 years and a significant number of cases, by clarity. By the specific quality of a person who is seeing something clearly rather than confusedly. By the recognition of specific individuals whom the patient identifies by name, and whom they describe with details that are, in the cases I have been able to verify, accurate to the person being described. And by the emotional character of comfort, the particular quality of a person who is in the presence of something reassuring rather than distressing. This is consistent with the nearing death awareness literature. It is also consistent with something else, which is a possibility I have arrived at slowly and reluctantly, and which I do not claim to have proved, and which I am telling you as the honest account of an experienced nurse who has been watching this closely for 9 years. The possibility is they are seeing something real. Chapter 4. The pattern, as I documented it over the first 4 years, had the following consistent features. It began between 2 and 7 days before death, not always exactly within this window. I have seen it begin 10 days before, and I have seen it begin hours before. But the modal range, the most common range, was between 2 and 7 days. It presented first as increased wakefulness at night. Patients who had been sleeping heavily, as palliative patients do, would begin waking in the small hours with an alertness that was inconsistent with their level of medication and their general physical condition. They would be awake and oriented, and their eyes would be moving in ways that tracked something in the room, not the random eye movements of delirium. Purposeful, directed movements, the movements of eyes following a specific object or person. When asked what they were looking at, they would tell you. Consistently, across patients with different backgrounds and different levels of prior religiosity and different cultural frameworks for death, they would tell you about the same category of thing: visitors, people who had come to be with them. Almost always, the visitors were deceased relatives or friends, people the patient had lost years or decades before, and who had simply, in the patient's account, come to the room. The visitors did not frighten the patients. I want to be very clear about this because it is the most medically significant and the most personally significant feature of the pattern. Not one patient in 11 years has described the visitors with fear. They have described them with recognition, with the specific emotional register of someone seeing a beloved face they had thought was gone forever. I have sat at the bedside of patients who were dying, and who were in the presence of something I could not see, and who were more at peace than they had been at any point in their illness, and the quality of that peace was not the peace of sedation. It was the peace of company. The visitors would come repeatedly in the days before death. The patient would report them at night and sometimes during the day. The same visitors returned, generally, rather than new ones arriving at each visit. The patient would speak to them sometimes in ordinary conversation, the way you speak to someone who is sitting with you. And as the days progressed and the death drew closer, the patients would report the visitors as more present, more vivid, sometimes more numerous. In the final hours, almost without exception, the patients would stop looking at the ceiling or the walls or the faces of the nurses and family in the room. They would look at something specific, something that appeared to be in the room with them, at a distance that varied, but that was typically at the foot of the bed or at a corner of the room. And their expression in those final minutes, was the expression I recognized from Margaret Osai on my first year on the ward. The expression of someone who has recognized a long missed face. Not once in 11 years have I seen a patient in the nearing death period look at whatever they were looking at with fear. This is the thing I have been trying to understand for 9 years. Part 2. The case is Chapter 5, Harold Finch. Room 9. Harold Finch was 74 years old, and he had been a civil engineer for his entire working life. A man who had spent 40 years building bridges and drainage systems in the northwest of England, and who had the particular quality of mind that long structural work produces: patient, systematic, resistant to conclusions that the available data did not support. He had congestive heart failure and a secondary pulmonary condition that had made the last 2 years of his life increasingly limited. And he had accepted the limitations with the same patience and systematic approach he had brought to everything else. He had made his plans. He had organized his affairs. He had said what needed to be said to the people who needed to hear it. When he came to the palliative floor, he was prepared in all the ways it was possible to prepare. He was not, he told me on his 3rd night, prepared for the cat. I said, "What cat?" He said, "The cat at the end of my bed. It has been there since last night. I have been attempting to determine whether it is real or not, and I have been unable to resolve the question." I looked at the end of his bed. There was no cat. He said, "I am aware that you cannot see it." I had assumed as much based on the behavior of the nurses who have come in since last night, none of whom have reacted to its presence in any way. This is itself data. I said, "What color is the cat?" He said, "Orange." A very particular shade of orange that I associate with one specific cat, which was my daughter's cat, who died 18 years ago. His name was Archie. He said this in the level and precise voice he used for all factual statements. He said, "I am not a superstitious man. I do not have beliefs about the afterlife. I am, however, an empiricist, and the empirical observation is that there is a cat at the end of my bed who matches the description of a cat I knew for 14 years. I am reporting this to you as a data point." I said, "I appreciate the data point." He said, "What I want to know is what it means." I thought about how to answer this. I thought about the careful answer and the honest answer and the answer that served Harold Finch best given what I knew about who he was and what kind of answer would be useful to him. I said, "In 11 years of working this floor, I have never seen a patient in your situation describe something frightening. I have seen many patients describe exactly what you are describing. The specific detail you are reporting, the specific match between what you are seeing and something from your own history, is consistent with every other account I have heard." He said, "You are suggesting it is real." I said, "I am suggesting that whatever it is, it appears to be something specific to you, something that belongs to your history, something that has come to be with you." He looked at the foot of the bed for a long time. He said, "Archie was a very good cat. My daughter was devastated when he died. I buried him in the garden myself, and I said a few words over the hole, which is something I would not have admitted to anyone at the time. I am not sure what it tells me that he has come back here, but I find that I do not mind his company." He died 4 days later. His daughter was there. She told me afterward that in the last hour he had been looking at the foot of the bed with the expression she recognized, she said, as the expression he used to have when Archie sat on his lap in the evenings and he pretended not to enjoy it while very clearly enjoying it. She had not known about the cat at the foot of the bed. I had not told her. She described the expression without any context for why it was that expression. I wrote it in my journal. I thought about it for a long time. Chapter 6. Dorothy Pierce and the children. Dorothy Pierce was 68 years old, and she had never married and had no children of her own. and had spent 50 years as a primary school teacher in the same school in a market town in Derbyshire, which she had left only when the lung cancer made continuing impossible. She came to us in October, and the autumn light in her room was the amber-orange light of late October afternoons, and she had the quality of a woman who had been surrounded by children for 50 years, and who was at ease with noise and movement, and the general vitality that children produced in a space. On the 5th night of her admission, I came in for her midnight check, and she was sitting up in bed and looking at the door with the expression of someone who is monitoring a situation. I said, "Are you all right, Dorothy?" She said, "I am quite all right. There are children in the corridor and I am keeping an eye on them because children in corridors at this hour require supervision and I am the adult nearest to them." I looked at the corridor through the open door. The corridor was the corridor. Dim and quiet, the nurse's station visible at the far end, one of my colleagues working at the desk. I said, "How many children?" She said, "4. A girl of perhaps 7 and 3 boys at various ages. They have been in the corridor for about 20 minutes. They do not appear to be distressed. I believe they are playing a game of some kind." I said, "Can you hear them?" She said, "No. They are silent. That is part of what has my attention. Children playing a silent game at midnight in a hospital corridor is an unusual combination of circumstances." She said this with the dry precision of a teacher of 50 years' experience, a woman for whom unusual combinations of circumstances involving children were something she had developed a professional response to. I pulled my chair to the doorway and I sat with her, and we both looked at the corridor. The corridor was empty except for my colleague at the far end. I said, "What are they doing now?" She said, "The girl is looking at me. She has been looking at me since I sat up. The boys are less interested." She tilted her head slightly. She said she has red hair, very particular red hair. I had a pupil with that exact color of hair 30 years ago. Her name was Catherine. She said it quietly, and the quiet of it had the quality of a woman receiving information she had not expected and was processing with care. She said, "Catherine died when she was 12. She was one of my students. A car accident on the Bakewell Road. I attended her funeral." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Do you know, I have thought about Catherine almost every year since. I have always thought there was something unfinished in it. She was a wonderful child." She looked at the empty corridor. She said, "She looks older than 12. She looks as though she has grown," which is either something my mind has produced or a piece of information I do not know how to account for. I sat with Dorothy until she was ready to sleep. She slept well that night and the 3 nights that followed, better than she had slept since admission. She continued to see the children in the corridor and sometimes in her room, and she spoke of them with the warmth of a woman who has spent her life surrounded by children and who found their presence a comfort rather than a disturbance. She died on the 8th night quietly, between my 2-hour checks. She was facing the door when I found her. Her expression was the expression I had come to know. Recognition and peace, the specific peace of someone who has been met by people who were glad to see them. I called her next of kin, a nephew who had been her primary visitor. He came in the following morning to collect her things and to sign the necessary papers, and he asked, as family members sometimes asked, whether she had been comfortable at the end. I said she had been comfortable. I said she had been in good spirits in her final days. I said she had spoken often of her students and of a particular girl she had been fond of. He said, "I wonder if that was the girl she always mentioned, Catherine something." She felt guilty about her for years. Said she wished she could know she was all right. I said, "I think she found out." He looked at me. I did not elaborate, but he nodded in a way that suggested he was prepared to take the answer as it was given. Chapter 7. The night of room 12, I have been careful in this account to write about individual patients rather than about the ward as a system, because the individual accounts are more honest and more respectful of the people involved than a general statistical summary would be. But there is one night I need to tell you about that was not about a single patient, and that I have been carrying for 5 years, and that is the reason this account exists. The reason I am writing this rather than keeping it in my personal journal where it has lived until now. It was a Thursday in March, 5 years ago. I was 3 hours into my shift, which meant it was approximately midnight. The ward was settled. I had done my first round, and all patients were stable, or as stable as palliative patients can be expected to be at midnight. There were 11 patients on the ward that night, 7 of them in the active dying phase, which was a high number for one shift, and which meant the evening had been busy with family, and with the particular intensity that the active dying phase brought to the ward. At midnight, the families had gone and the ward was quiet. My colleague that night was a nurse named Sandra who had been on the palliative floor for 15 years, and who was the person I trusted most on any shift, not because she was technically superior, though she was very good, but because she had the quality I valued above all others in the people I worked with, which was that she was present. Fully, genuinely present with the patients and with the work, in the way that some people were present and most people only approximated. Sandra was at the far end of the ward doing her checks. I was at the nurse's station, updating notes. At approximately 10 past midnight, the call bell from room 12 sounded. Room 12 was occupied by a man named Arthur Carmichael, who was 79 and who had been in the active dying phase for 36 hours. He was deeply unconscious and had not been responsive to voice or touch since the previous afternoon. He was not expected to be alive when I came in for the following night's shift. An unconscious patient cannot ring a call bell. I went to room 12. Arthur Carmichael was in the bed in the condition I had last seen him in, lying on his back, breathing in the specific irregular pattern of someone in the final stage, his hands at his sides. He was not awake. He was not responsive, but the call bell indicator light was illuminated. I looked at the bell, which was attached to the bed rail where it always was. Arthur's hand was not near it. Nothing was near it. The bell had been rung by nothing that I could identify. I stood in room 12 for a moment. Then I felt it. I have been trying to describe this accurately for 5 years, and the most accurate description I have is this: the room had more people in it than the room had people in it. I know how that sounds. I'm a nurse with 11 years of experience and a scientific education, and I am telling you that I stood in room 12 at 10 past midnight, and the room, which contained one unconscious dying man and myself, felt occupied in the way of a room with a great many people in it, all of them very quiet. Not threatening, not frightening in the conventional way of something that wants to harm you. The feeling was not that kind of feeling. It was the feeling of presence, of a great deal of presence, gathered in a specific room for a specific reason, and the reason was the man in the bed. I stood in room 12 and I said, very quietly, "He is not alone. We know that. We are with him." The quality of the room did not change in any way I could measure, but something released in me when I said it. Some tension I had been carrying without knowing I was carrying it, some resistance to what the room was, some insistence on the ordinary explanation that was no longer serving the evidence. I said it and I meant it, and the room was the room, and Arthur Carmichael was dying in it, surrounded by whatever had gathered to be with him, and I was there too, and that was enough. He died at 4 in the morning, the deepest point of the night. Sandra was with him. She came to the nurse's station afterward with the expression she had on these occasions, which was the expression of someone who had witnessed something they held with respect rather than analyzing. She said, "Did you feel the room earlier?" I said yes. She said, "It was a full room." I said yes. We sat at the nurse's station for a while in the 4 in the morning quiet. Sandra said, 15 years. They are always accompanied. I have never sat with one who was not accompanied. I thought about that. I said none. She said not once. Every single one of them is accompanied. Part 3. The Thing That Changed Chapter 8. My mother came to the palliative floor 7 months ago. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say she came to the palliative floor, because precision matters here, and I find myself resisting imprecision in ways I do not fully understand. She did not come to my ward. She came to a palliative floor in a different hospital in a different city, which was the floor where she had been transferred when her breast cancer reached the stage that her oncologist described with the careful language that oncologists use. The language of transition, of shifting the goals of care, of comfort and quality over intervention. She was 71. She had been my mother for 40 years and my colleague in the way that mothers of nurses are colleagues, in the way that she had understood my work and its particular demands, in a way that required no explanation. She had been my best audience for 11 years of night shift stories. She was the person who had given me, when I was 9 years old, and she was a district nurse in the community, and brought home the serious version of herself in the evenings rather than the daytime version. The first piece of information I had about what end-of-life work was. She had said, over dinner on an evening I still remember specifically, "I sat with a woman today who was dying, and her face at the end was the most peaceful face I have ever seen. Whatever she was looking at in those last minutes, it was something very good. I had been 9. I had not forgotten it. I drove to the other city and I was with her for the last 4 days. I did not work. I was her daughter, not a palliative nurse, and I sat in the chair beside her bed the way families sat, and I talked to her and held her hand and watched the ward be the ward, which was different from mine in the details and the same in the essential things. On the 3rd day, she was awake in the morning, which surprised the nurses on her care, and she was alert and specific in the way I had seen my own patients be alert and specific in the days before death. The terminal lucidity that the literature described, and that I had observed many times, but had not observed from this angle. She looked at me and she said, "Your father is here." My father had died 12 years before, of a stroke, quickly and without the extended process that my mother was going through. I said, "Where is he?" She said, "By the window. He has been there since yesterday. He is not saying much. He is just being there," which is exactly like him. She said this with the affection and exasperation of a woman who had been married to a man for 42 years and who knew his habits completely. I looked at the window. The window was the window. She said, "He looks younger than I remember. Not young, just younger. Less tired than he was at the end." She said, "He looks like himself, the way he was when we first met, before all the living wore some of it away." I sat with her, and I did not try to explain this away, and I did not try to make it into something I could handle with clinical language. I just sat with it and with her, and I looked at the window, and I thought about my father, and about the specific quality of his presence in a room, which had been a contained and unhurried presence. A man who was comfortable with silence in a way that made the silence comfortable for others. She said, "Are you all right, love?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You look the way you look when you are processing something." I said, "I am processing something." She said, "He is glad you are here." I said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because I know him, and because he keeps looking at you." I looked at the window for a long time. I said, "Tell him I said hello." She smiled. She had my father's hands, the specific long-fingered hands that I had inherited from neither of them, and she put one of those hands on mine. She said, "He already knows." Chapter 9. The fourth night. On the fourth night, I was alone with her. It was a Thursday, and it was 2 in the morning, which was the specific quality of 2 in the morning that I knew better than any other hour, and the ward was quiet in the way of the floor I worked on at this hour. She had not been responsive since the previous afternoon. Her breathing was the breathing I knew, the Cheyne-Stokes pattern, the irregular rise and fall of someone whose brain stem was managing the mechanics of breathing without the participation of any higher function. She was present in the room only in the physical sense. Whatever she was doing somewhere else. I held her hand and I talked to her the way I talked to my own patients in this state. I told her about the ward and about the patients I had been caring for and about the particular Tuesday in February when I had sat with a man named Harold and a cat named Archie, and I had understood something about my work that had not been clear before. I told her about room 12 and about what Sandra had said at 4 in the morning. I told her, "I know you are not alone. I know Dad is there. I know it is all right." Then I said, "You were right about the face when you told me about the woman when I was 9. You were right. It is something very good." The room was the room. The monitoring equipment made its sounds. The ward beyond the door was quiet, and then the quality of the room changed. I had felt this in room 12, and I had felt it, more subtly, in 100 rooms across 9 years on the night shift, but I had never felt it this close. The quality of the room gathering, filling, the sense of more presence than was physically accounted for, the specific feeling of a room with many people in it, all being very quiet. I looked up from my mother's face. I cannot tell you what I saw. I want to be honest about this limitation rather than claiming a clarity I did not have. I can tell you that the room was different from an empty room in a way that was visible as well as felt. That the particular quality of the space near the foot of the bed and near the window was different from the quality of the space around the monitoring equipment or the door. I can tell you that the difference had a warmth to it that the medical equipment did not have and that the window at 4 in the morning did not have. I said, "I see you," or "I see that you are here." The room was the room. My mother breathed in. She breathed out. She breathed in. She breathed out. That was the last breath. I sat with her for a long time afterward, in the room that was full of something I could feel and not see, and I held her hand, and I thought about 40 years, and the particular specific fact of the person I had just lost, and the particular specific fact of what I had seen and felt and understood across 9 years of the night shift. The room gradually returned to its ordinary quality. Not all at once. Gradually, over perhaps 20 minutes, the additional presence in the room diminished and withdrew, and the room was the room again, quiet and clinical, and lit in the specific way of a hospital room at night with the monitoring equipment on, and the window showing the dark car park and the sky above it. I called the nurse at the desk. I did what needed to be done. I was her daughter doing what needed to be done, which was the only role available to me in that room and the only role I wanted. Then I went to the car park and I sat in my car in the dark and I stayed there for a long time. Part 4. What I understand now, Chapter 10. The night shift. Now I went back to work 6 weeks after my mother died. This was what the occupational health team recommended, and it was the right recommendation because the work was where I needed to be. And being where I needed to be was the most useful prescription for grief that I had ever encountered, which was consistent with what most of the patients I had watched grieve had reported. I went back on a Monday in October, and Sandra was on with me, and we worked the shift the way we had worked hundreds of shifts. And the ward was the ward, and the patients were the patients, and the work was the work. At 3 in the morning, I was sitting with a patient named Eileen, who was 76, and who was in the early nearing death phase, and who was awake and alert in the specific way, and who had been telling me for the past hour about the people she could see in her room. Her husband, who had died 7 years before. Her sister, who had died when they were both in their 30s. A friend from her working years whose name she could not remember but whose face she recognized completely. She said, "Does this happen to everyone?" I said, "In my experience, yes. Everyone is accompanied." She said, "I thought I would be frightened. I have been frightened of this for a long time." I said, "Are you frightened now?" She looked at the foot of her bed at the point where her husband apparently was. She said, "No. It is like being afraid of a party and then arriving at the party and finding that all the people you love most are there." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "That is the best description I have ever heard." She said, "Is your mother gone?" I looked at her. She said, "I can sometimes tell when nurses have lost someone recently. You have the look of someone who has recently understood something." I said, "Yes. She died 7 weeks ago." Eileen looked at me for a moment with the particular and direct attention of someone who is on the other side of a boundary and who can see things from there that you cannot yet see from here. She said, "She is not far." I said nothing. She said, "I do not mean this to be a comfort I am inventing. I mean it as a report." I believed her. I believed her the way I believed all of them, which was not with certainty but with the specific and earned openness of someone who has been sitting with dying people for 9 years and who has run out of reasons to explain away what they consistently and calmly report. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Is there anything you want to say? If you wanted to say something to her, I could try to pass it along. I cannot guarantee the delivery." She said this with a gentle humor, the humor of someone who is in the proximity of something vast and has decided that humor was an appropriate response to vastness. I thought for a moment. I said, "Tell her I know she was right about the face. She told me something when I was 9 years old about a woman she sat with and the face at the end, and she was right, and I have spent 11 years learning how right she was." Eileen smiled. She closed her eyes. She said, "I expect she already knows that too." Chapter 11. The questions I no longer ask. I used to ask whether what my patients saw was real. I asked this question for the first 4 years with genuine and open curiosity, which I think was the appropriate way to ask it. I wanted to understand the evidence, and I wanted to follow the evidence where it led. I read the literature. I observed carefully. I documented. I no longer ask the question in the same way, which is not because I have resolved it, but because I have understood something about it that changes its nature. The question of whether what my patients see is real is a question that assumes a stable and agreed upon definition of real. And 11 years of palliative nursing at night have given me serious reservations about whether that definition is as stable and agreed upon as it appears in the daylight hours when the machine is running. At night, in a room with a dying person and the particular quality that rooms have in those circumstances, the definition of real seems more permeable than it does elsewhere. Not in a frightening way. In the way of a membrane that is thinner than you thought, that allows more through in both directions than the solid wall you had assumed it was. I believe my patients see what they report seeing. I believe this because I trust their reports, and because their reports are consistent, and because they are delivered with the clarity and specificity of real experience, rather than the confusion and disorientation of neurological artifact. I believe it because I have felt what I have felt in the rooms, and because what I felt corresponded to what they reported, and because my mother was accompanied by my father at her death, and the room was full of something at the moment of her last breath. What I do not know is the nature of what they see. I do not know whether the people who come are the people they appear to be in any straightforward metaphysical sense. I do not know what it means for someone who has been dead for 40 years to come to a hospital room in the north of England in October and sit by a window. I do not have the framework for what that means, and I am not sure any available framework is adequate. What I know is what Sandra said at 4 in the morning, which is the most important piece of clinical knowledge I have accumulated in 9 years on the night shift. Not one of them is alone, not a single one in 11 years. Every person I have watched die has been accompanied. Every person who has reported their visitors to me has reported them with comfort and recognition rather than fear. Every room I have sat in at the moment of death has had the quality of a room with more in it than the people I could see. I cannot tell you what this means about what happens after death. I cannot tell you what this means about the nature of consciousness, or the persistence of identity, or any of the large questions that people want answered. I am a nurse and not a theologian or a philosopher, and those are not my questions to answer. I can tell you what it means for the work. What it means for the work is this: no one arrives at the end alone. Whatever you believe about what comes after, about the mechanics of death and what they produce, the evidence of 11 years of watching is that the moment of dying is not a solitary one. Something comes to meet you, something that knows you, something that has been waiting with the specific patience of people who love you and who have been somewhere you have not yet been, and who are glad to bring you there. Chapter 12, The Boy in Room 3 Last Week. I am writing this last week because last week was the week I decided to stop keeping this in my journal and start writing it down properly, the way it deserved to be written down. And the reason last week made me decide this was a boy named Thomas in room 3. Thomas was 11 years old. He had a brain tumor, which had been diagnosed 8 months before, and which had resisted the treatment that was tried, and which had progressed with the specific cruelty of pediatric oncology, the cruelty of something that takes the people who should have the most time. I do not work with children normally. Adult palliative care is my floor, and I have kept it that way by choice, the specific choice of someone who knows their limits. But the pediatric palliative unit was short-staffed last Tuesday, and the nurse manager asked if I would cover 2 hours at the start of the shift, and I said yes, and Thomas was in room 3. He was awake when I came in. He was thin in the specific way of a child who has been through 8 months of treatment. Thin in a way that made him look simultaneously younger and much older than 11. And his eyes were the eyes of someone who had been living with something very large for a long time, and who had made a kind of accommodation with it. He said, "Are you the new nurse?" I said, "For tonight." "My name is Catherine." He said, "There is a woman in my room who says she knows you." I looked at him. I looked at the room. The room was the room. He said, "She has been here for 2 days. She says she was a nurse too." He said this in the matter-of-fact way of an 11-year-old who has been in a hospital for 8 months and who has arrived, through some combination of intelligence and necessity, and the specific wisdom of children who have been close to death, at a state of equanimity about what he sees that most adults take decades to approximate. He said, "She has gray hair." She said her name is Ellen. My mother's name was Ellen. I sat down in the chair beside his bed. He said, "She said to tell you that she was right. She said you would know what that means." I sat in the chair and I looked at the room, and I thought about a dinner table in a house that no longer existed, and a 9-year-old version of myself listening to my mother say. Her face at the end was the most peaceful face I have ever seen. Whatever she was looking at in those last minutes, it was something very good. Thomas said, "She says that she is watching out for me." He said it simply, the way he said everything. As a report, I said, "Good." He said, "I am not scared of dying. I want you to know that. People keep acting like I should be scared, and I am not. There are too many people here already for it to be something to be scared of. He said, "Your mum is one of them." I sat in the chair in room 3, and the room was full of everything it was full of. And Thomas looked at the corner nearest the window with the calm and specific attention of a child who sees something interesting. And I looked at the same corner, and I did not see what he saw, but I felt it the way I always felt it. The quality of presence in a space that is more occupied than it appears. I said, "Thomas, are there a lot of them?" He considered this. He said, "Yes. More than I expected." He said, "It is like your mum said, it is something very good." Chapter 13. What I want you to know, I have been a palliative care nurse for 11 years, and I have been on the night shift for 9 of those years. And I have sat with more people at the end of their lives than I can easily count. And what I want you to know is what I have observed across all of those sittings. I want you to know that every single person I have watched die has been accompanied. Not some of them, not most of them, everyone. I want you to know that the people who come to accompany them are people they have loved and lost, people who died before them, and who come back in the days and hours before death to be present. I have heard from patient after patient that the visitors look younger, look less tired, look like themselves in a way that predates the particular wearing down that long lives produce. They come as themselves, the best version of themselves, and they come without agenda except the agenda of being present. I want you to know that the dying are not afraid of what they see. Not one of the patients I have cared for has described the nearing death visitors with fear. They describe them with recognition, with the specific and unguarded warmth of someone seeing a beloved face they thought they had lost forever. They describe it as a reunion. I want you to know that the rooms are full at the moment of death, of something I cannot see and can feel. I have felt this in 100 rooms, and I felt it in my mother's room, and I felt it in room 3 last week, and the feeling is not frightening. The feeling is the feeling of a great deal of care concentrated in a small space for a specific person. The feeling of being witnessed at the most important moment of your existence by everyone who has ever loved you. I want you to know this because I think most people are afraid of death in a way that the evidence does not support. I think we are afraid of it being cold and dark and alone, and it is not any of those things. I have watched it hundreds of times, and it is none of those things. I want you to know this so that you are not afraid, not so that you will not grieve for the people who die. Grief is correct and necessary, and I would not take it from anyone. But the fear of death as a solitary and terrible darkness, that specific fear, is a fear I have 9 years of evidence against. No one goes alone. Not one. I have never seen it happen. I do not expect to. Chapter 14. 3 in the morning. I am writing this at 3 in the morning. I am on shift. The ward is quiet, and I am at the nurse's station, and Sandra is doing her rounds, and the floor is the floor. In room 6, a woman named Agnes is in the final hours. She is 92, and she has had a long and full life, and she has been telling me since Monday about the people who have come to visit. Her husband, gone for 20 years. Her parents, gone for longer. A best friend from her early 20s who died of an illness that could be treated now, but could not be treated then. They have all been coming in, she says, and the room has been getting fuller as the days progress, the way a room fills before a party begins. She used exactly that word, party. I went in to check her at 2:30 and she was sleeping. Her breathing was the breathing I knew, the specific pattern of the final hours. She will not be alive when the day shift arrives. I sat with her for a while. The room had the quality it always had at this stage, full and warm with something I could feel and not see. I said quietly to the room and to whatever was in it, I know you are here. I know she is not alone. Thank you for coming. The room was the room. I went back to the nurse's station. Sandra came back from her rounds and we sat together in the specific silence of 3 in the morning on a palliative floor that has been our shared geography for 9 years, and she said, "Room 6. I said, "Soon." She said, "Full room." I said, "Very full." She poured 2 cups of tea from the pot she had made at 2, and she put one in front of me, and she picked up her own, and she said, with the quiet and absolute certainty of someone who has been doing this for 15 years, "I love this job." I held my tea, and I thought about Margaret Osai and Harold Finch and Dorothy Pierce and Arthur Carmichael, and my mother and Thomas in room 3 and Agnes in room 6, who was dying in a full room at 3 in the morning. I said, "So do I." We sat in the 3 in the morning quiet, the 2 of us, and outside the windows the dark was the specific dark of the small hours before dawn, and on the floor the patients slept or did not sleep, and some of them could see things that we could not, and all of them were accompanied. All of them. Every single one. End.